Okay, great. So we can get started. And welcome everyone that we are so happy to have you. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the country. We are located in Southern California, but we know that we're from all over, so very happy to have you. So we are Psymark, and we're presenting today on our digital visual motor progress monitoring assessments. The focus is for the OT professional, but of course we welcome everyone to attend. So at today's webinar, we're really going to take an extensive look and do really a deep dive into our progress monitoring tools. Those are Psymark shapes, Psymark letters, and numbers. And we will talk about many ways that the metrics can inform interventions and provide positive outcomes. And I know we have 2 more poll questions, so Allison, if you want to do those.
All right, so it looks like 84% of our audience is an OT. We have 13% CODAs and 3% as educators.
Great, okay.
And it looks like most of our audience is working in the school. 6% is working in a clinic and 8% as other.
All right, that's good for us to know. So most of us are school-based. We are so happy to have you. We do have information too about clinic-based as well. So again, welcome to everyone. So with our learning objectives today, we are going to be learning to use the visual progress monitoring apps, the shapes, letters, and numbers. With that, really focusing on assessment and interpretation of that data and the self-scoring, really understanding the metrics behind it, and then using that data to inform those targeted interventions. So discussing writing baselines, using the graphs, and the different tools for those interventions. So who is Psymark? Well, Psymark was started by a small team of us. We are school psychologists, educators, and researchers. We were in the field and recognized that need for digital assessment tools. We were using paper and pencil and thought there must be a better way of understanding visual motor skills and helping to identify our students' needs to create those personalized interventions and monitoring the effectiveness of those interventions. So today we have 3 people here. Our authors are, I am Dr. Karen Silberman. I'm one of the founders and I have the privilege of leading our team at Psymark. I have worked in education for many years. I served as a teacher, school psychologist, and finally as a special education director. I've presented at numerous conferences, including AOTA, NASP, and CASP. And I am also the mother of a child who struggled himself. He's now an adult, but he struggled with visual motor issues. So I like to say that I've sat at every chair at an IEP meeting. I've been the mother, the teacher, the school psychologist, and the director. We also have with us today Dr. Dana Kudaverdian, and for the past 20+ years, Dana has worked to promote meaningful outcomes for individuals with learning differences and other life-impacting conditions. She has presented at many professional conferences and served also as the president of the Foothill Association of School Psychologists. She's conducted research aiming at advancing assessment and practice. And she is a school psychologist by training, educational psychologist, special education program specialist, test developer, and also one of our founding partners here at Psymark. We are thrilled today to have Kimberly Coates, our occupational therapist. Kim is an OT, and she got her master's degree in occupational therapy from USC. She's been working as the lead OT in a Southern California school district for the past 10 years and independently created the district's first in-house OT program. Throughout her career, she has worked closely with pediatric special needs populations, including students with autism, intellectual disability, ADHD, specific learning disabilities, visual impairments, orthopedic impairments, and others. Kim enjoys hiking, photography, and tending to her ever-growing collection of houseplants. So coming back to this slide, yes, we're going to be discussing today the first ever digital visual motor progress monitoring tools. And that leads us into visual motor integration. So most people call this eye-hand coordination. It's, as we know, a complex skill set that encompasses visual perception, motor control, and communication between the brain and spinal cord, and those electrical impulses to the extremities. And as we know, it can be damaged due to diseases such as Parkinson's, trauma due to conditions like accidents, or conditions such as specific learning disabilities or ADHD. So there is a great deal of research in visual motor. Carson in 2021 gave this description as the ability to perceive visual input, process the information, and coordinate a motor response using eye-hand coordination, praxis, visual motor skills, gross motor coordination, and fine motor. It is that ability to control hand movements through vision, and it's necessary for lots of different activities, both academic and non-academic alike. Visual motor deficits are associated with a wide variety of disorders, including things like Alzheimer's, TBI, ADHD, and others. And it's also been understood as a long been understood as a key domain in functioning for students and implicated in disorders with reading, so such as reading fluency, reading comprehension, and written language. Fine motor skills are also correlated with academic performance. So hitting those fine motor skills early can help also with academic performance. And the assessment of visual motor assessment has historically been used with paper pencil, and tools such as the VERY or the DTVP2 and others. So current progress monitoring is really using paper pencil. And we used this quote from Nancy Mather in her book from 2009, that there's very little guidance, as you know, as OTs in the field, to assist the evaluator in judging whether an accommodation for a particular student is appropriate and reasonable. So with current progress monitoring, as we know, it's used with paper pencil, it's very informal, generally subjective, and you're analyzing that information after the production. Scoring by hand using rulers and protractors and trying to use checklists with that very professional view of eyeballing. So with our tools, we have developed them to be quick and easy to administer. Generally takes about 10 minutes to both administer and score. They're dynamic, so it's capturing all of these features in real time. They're self-scoring and objective, and they look at multiple features. So we have 9 different features that we provide for you to monitor for your students. They can inform our targeted interventions and give very objective data for your IEPs. So in writing those baseline goals and interventions, You also get charts and graphs that can be shared with your parents, teachers, or even your clients themselves. And we have heard that they are highly motivating, especially for those people who are reluctant to use paper and pencil. So our first study looked at differences between paper, pencil, stylus, and finger. And there were no significant differences between these. So with our tools, you can either have your examinee use either a stylus or their finger, depending on the comfort level of your examinee. Okay, so with the test, you get results within minutes. And as I said, they're self-scoring. We will go into detail about these multiple features, but this is a look at what the scoring table looks like. You can quickly and easily identify those areas of strength and weakness to help to inform your interventions. And then you can use the tool to monitor progress over time, and you can see the graphic display so you can monitor the effectiveness of those interventions. So we do have 3 different tests and progress monitoring tools: the visual motor progress shapes, or VMP shapes, VMP numbers, and VMP letters, and we will be discussing all 3 today. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Dana.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be with you today, attending wherever you are. And thank you for your interest in Psymark and the Psymark tools. So in the next few sections, I will be reviewing Psymark's administration process from start to finish. I'll also be describing the scoring, including the multiple scoring features and the data that it yields for you. And then I'll be sharing a framework for interpretation. So we'll be reviewing administration, scoring, and interpretation. But as most of you were not at the Lunch and Learn, and most of you have not yet used the test, I'll first give you an introduction so you'll have an idea of what the test looks like. As Karen said, there are 3 progress monitoring assessment tools. They are shapes, letters, and numbers. Next slide. And this is an example of shapes. This is what shapes looks like on an iPad. So an examinee is presented with 12 shapes of increasing difficulty, and the examinee is instructed to look at the shape above the line and the space above the line, and to copy the shape exactly as it is in the space below the line. And they're also asked to just do their best. Next. And here is an example of the drawing. Next. And this is a photo of shapes actually being administered. Next slide. The second assessment tool is letters. And with letters, an examinee is presented with 16 selected letters. And as with shapes, the instructions are the same. They're asked to look at the letter in the space above the line and to copy the letter exactly as they see it in the space below the line, and to just do their best. Next. And here is an example of the drawing. Next. And here is a photo of what letters actually looks like being administered. Next slide. Finally, the third assessment tool is numbers. And With numbers, an examinee is presented with 10 numbers from 0 to 9. And just like with shapes or letters, the instructions are exactly the same. You ask them to look at the number in the space above the line and to copy the number exactly as they see it in the space below the line and to just do their best. Next. And here is an example of what the copying looks like. Next. And this is a photo, an actual photo of numbers being administered on the iPad. Next slide. So in this next section, I'm going to walk you through the administration process from start to finish. When I say start to finish, I mean from beginning when you open up the app on your iPad all the way until the scores appear. Next slide. But before we begin, I just want to share this kind of nice feature that when you open the iPad, you do have the opportunity to always review the instructions if you so wish. And if you don't, you can say don't show again or dismiss. Next slide. Okay, so when you first open the iPad, it will take you, and you first open the app, it will take you to the home screen. And this is what the home screen looks like. And you'll see there are 3 buttons across the top, or tabs. One says existing examinees, the middle one says new examinee, and then the third are tutorials. So in order to administer the test, you need to create an examinee record first. So if you have already created an examinee record and you've already given the test, you want to press the existing examinees tab, and that will take you to your list and you can find your examinee and you can retest them. However, I'm going to take you through the first time that you've ever administered a test, and so you would want to create an examinee record first, and you do that by first pressing the new examinee button. Next. Thank you. And when you press it, it will take you to the examinee information page, and so this is what the page looks like. It's a one-pager. Pretty easy. There's lots of drop-down menus. It's pretty fast. And again, you do this all on the iPad. There is an area for name, but it instructs you not to use the examinee's real name, instead to use a nickname or a unique identifier. You can also put in a symbol. It accepts symbols as well, any way that you can identify the examinee and secures their privacy. Other information that you would provide is the birth date, gender, and there is also an other, ethnicity, handedness, and then there is a toggle button. So if the examinee that you wish to administer the test to has a known neurological condition that would impact their visual motor ability, you would want to toggle that button. It seems like most of you are school-based, so most of you are working with students who qualify for special education. So you would want to, if they've qualified already, you would want to click the button. A drop-down menu will come down and all of the 13 categories of special education will appear, and you just will choose all those that your student qualifies for. There's also a drop-down menu for medical and psychiatric diagnoses. This is especially helpful for those of you that, and I know not too many of you are working in a clinic or a hospital situation where you can indicate what the condition or diagnosis is. There's also a drop-down menu for current medications. If there are medications that the examinee is taking that may impact their visual motor performance. And then at the very bottom, there's a place where you certify that you have permission to collect this information and give this information as part of your scope of practice, or that you're supervised by, for example, an occupational therapist, or PT, educator, school psychologist, neurologist, etc. Next slide. So once you have created the record, you are ready to administer the test. But before I show you that, how easy it is, before we begin that, if you look up in the right-hand corner, you'll see it says Edit Demographics. If you ever say, oh, I should have done this, or I made a mistake here, you can go back and you can edit the demographics page. So once you've created a record, you would press on the plus sign. So you've now given the iPad to the examinee, who is in front of you or next to you, and you would press that plus sign, and then the test will begin. Next slide. And this is just an example. So if you press that, here's an example of letters. Your examinee would begin to copy the 16 letters. And when your examinee gets to the 16th, then the next page will show up. Next slide. It's the test complete page. So when the examinee has completed it, it will automatically, this page will automatically show up, the test complete page. And on this page, you will see, you will indicate whether or not the examinee used their finger or a stylus. The default is finger, so it should default and you don't have to do anything, but if they used a stylus, then you would want to click on stylus. And you would now have the iPad with you, and if there are notes, if there's anything that you would like to remember about how the examinee approached the performance, you can write it in the notes. Anything about their behavior or the positioning of the iPad, anything at all that you want to remember, these notes will appear on the test results page so that you will remember exactly how they approached the task. So when you are finished, you would press Save Test. And when you do this, next slide, the scores won't appear yet because they are password protected. So you will want to input your PIN, and this is a way to assure confidentiality and privacy, and also to assure that you, as a professional, are the only ones that are seeing the results. Next slide. So once you have put in your PIN, then the test will begin to process for scoring. It takes just a few minutes for scoring, but I want to just say a note that you will need Wi-Fi for the test to score. Now, you can administer the test without Wi-Fi, but you'll need to go to a place where there is Wi-Fi, and you'll have to hit the sync button for the test to score. Next slide. So after a couple of minutes, the scores will appear, and this is what it looks like, and I'll be talking a little bit more about the scores later, but if you look at the results page, you will see the bar graph, the single test results graph, an easy way where you can look and see strengths and weaknesses instantly. You'll also see V-scores, which are numerical scores. You'll also see raw scores, and I'll be going over each of those scores and let you know what they mean. Next. If you've given the test more than once, you've retested your examinee, you'll have access to the progress monitoring chart, as Karen showed, so that you can see if your interventions were effective, and you can monitor progress. And if you look closely, you can see this is the accuracy composite that you're looking at. There's a little gray box there. It's pushed, and the accuracy score comes up. Next. But you can also look at other variables. You can look at the progress. If you see the blue line, that's scale or sizing. And you can also, if you're targeting that, you can also monitor the progress of scale or rotation, line precision, noise, any of what we call V-scores that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Next slide. Okay, so we have reviewed the administration, and now I'm going to talk about Psymark scoring. Next slide. So Psymark provides two types of scores. They are V-scores, which stands for visual motor scores, and measured dynamic scores of performance. And these are the real-time scores, not after the fact, but how the measurement of how the examinee approached the task. Next slide. So what are V-scores? V-scores are computer-generated visual motor ability scores, and they describe the relationship between the students or the examinee's drawing and the stimulus image, the model, how similar the drawing is to the model or how dissimilar the drawing is to the model. And V-scores range from 0 to 100. 0 meaning not a thing like the model, very dissimilar, and 100 meaning an exact copy of the model, basically. And V-scores can be compared for the same individual over time. Obviously, it is perfect for progress monitoring. Next slide. So here is an analogy that I think that we can all relate to, and that has to do with the written driving test that we have to take from time to time at the Department of Motor Vehicles, that dreaded driving test. So the written driving test is not standardized, and the scores are not scaled as compared to other test takers. However, a higher score means better performance on the test, and increasing scores over time indicate increasing competence in the knowledge of the rules of driving. And so it is with V-scores. Similarly, increasing V-scores indicate improved visual motor ability on the variable that's being measured. Next slide. And here is another example of progress monitoring over time. So V-scores, again, can be interpreted like any criterion reference score or raw scores that allow for comparisons over time. That's one of the things it's wonderful for. So here we have an example in the box. We have an individual, an examinee, who took the Psymark test at time 1, and then a little bit later was retested. So at the first testing time on a V-score variable, the individual received a score of 45. And then after interventions, and 45 is a little bit low, so after interventions or treatment was applied, at time 2, the same individual received a V-score on that variable of 65. So went from 45 to 65. So what we can say is that at the second test time 2, the score on that variable has improved. Next slide. And this is also reflected on the progress monitoring chart. You can see a visual on the chart itself of that improvement. Next slide. So here's another example of how you can use V-scores. You can also compare the performance of more than one individual. So here we have in the box, we have student A and student B, or client A and client B. And student A receives a score of 60 on a V-score, and student B on the same variable receives a score of 70. What we can say is that student B's drawing was more similar to the sample, to the model on that variable. Next slide. So here are the V-scores that we have on the Psymark app. It provides an accuracy composite, which is the overall performance score, and it's derived from these subtests. It's derived from rotation, which is the rotation of the examinee's drawing as compared to the model. Sometimes it's called orientation. We call it rotation. Also, scale. Scale refers to sizing of the drawing as compared to the model. Is it bigger? Is it smaller? Line precision is a measure of the lines within the expected range, where we expect the lines to be, basically. And noise are stray lines outside of the expected range. Next slide. And here on the app itself, you will, on the results table, this is where you would find the numerical values for the V-scores. You can see accuracy composite, you can see rotation, scale, line precision, and noise. Next slide. Also, on the results table, you will also see the V-scores depicted on the bar graph, as I showed earlier. And this is just such a nice way to eyeball and look at strengths and weaknesses. So if you look at the bar graph, the test results graph, you will see the accuracy composite and the subtests of rotation, scale, line precision, and noise. Next slide. The second type of scoring that we have are the measured dynamic scores of performance. These are the real-time measurements, the real-time scores on how the examinee approached the task. And these scores include the number of lifts, which is the number of times the student or examinee lifted their finger or the stylus off the screen, contact time, the total time in seconds that the student or examinee's finger or stylus was in contact with the screen, the average speed, so which is the measure of the average speed of the drawing itself, of the lines in centimeters per second, and line speed consistency, which has to do with the variability in the speed. And we find that it is related to speed, and it is usually half of speed. So if speed was 4, it may be 2, plus or minus 1. Next slide. So here on the test results table are the performance scores. They're under, it says raw scores. So the raw scores are the measured performance scores. And you'll also see underneath, we also let you know if every item was able to be scored. Sometimes, and if it is so dissimilar, or if there's something unusual, for example, if the examinee went so fast, they hardly touched the screen at all, it may not be able to score the drawing. So if we say that if fewer than 70% are scored, we recommend that the examinee be retested again. Next slide. Another really helpful feature is this question mark. If you are wondering, gosh, what was scale again? I forgot exactly what it was. You just press on the question mark and a pop-up will give you the definition of what that subtest refers to. Next slide. So here's a pop-up for scale. Next slide. And here's a pop-up describing noise. Next slide. Okay, so I've taken you through the administration process. We've talked about the scoring, and so now we're going to provide a framework for interpretation, and we'll practice a little bit as well. Next slide. So the steps for interpretation go like this. First, the first step is to administer the Psymark test, and you administer it to establish a baseline. Now you have your baseline scores. And from these scores, from this data, you can develop your treatment goals. or your service goals, or your session goals, or your intervention goals, or your IEP goals. You can also determine the intervention plan or the treatment plan, or your intervention targets, because you'll have lots of information that may help you figure out where you really need to target your therapy or your sessions. We say treatment plans as well because this can be used in hospital settings and with individuals of all ages. Say Parkinson's, for example, and maybe part of the treatment plan is a medication, and the medication, we have a pre-test and a post-test to look at the effectiveness of the medication. So it can be also used for that. So once you have a baseline, you've developed goals, you've determined your intervention targets in your treatment plans or intervention plans, then the next thing to do is, of course, implement the intervention, implement the treatment, and do it for a period of time. And then you are ready to retest. And when you retest, you can see if the treatment, if the intervention was effective. Next slide. And here is the interpretation framework, just presented a little bit differently for those of us who learn different ways. We have an arrow, and so first thing, you look at the base, you administer the test, you establish baseline scores, then you review those scores. What are the high scores? What are the low scores? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are some of those performance features that may be impacting visual motor? So from that data, from that review, then you develop your goals and you target your interventions and you implement your interventions over time, and then you retest to progress monitor and to really look at the impact of those interventions on the visual motor, on the accuracy. And just a note to say that you can retest multiple times to assess the effectiveness of an intervention. Maybe something doesn't work, you try something else. You are able to do pre and post to determine whether an intervention is effective or a treatment is effective. Next slide. Okay, so now we are going to practice a little bit. Here is Cindy's test. This is her baseline. This is the first time she's taken the Psymark test, and we have her scores, and they're presented here on the results page. Next. And so what we want to do is we really want to now review those scores. We want to look at the bar graph, which you can easily see the strengths and weaknesses. We want to look at those V scores, the numerical values that are presented. And then we want to look also at the performance scores. So in looking at this using our interpretation framework, what does the information tell us about Cindy's performance? And I'm just going to wait about 10 seconds or so that you have an opportunity just to take a look at Cindy's scores and come up with ideas. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you might have noticed a lot of things. For me, the first thing I usually do is I look at the results graph, the bar graph, because I can easily see the strengths and weaknesses. And when I look at it, I look at the accuracy composite, and I can see it's kind of low. But I'm looking at rotation. I'm looking at line precision. I'm looking at noise, and they're all pretty good. They're pretty stable. They're pretty aligned. However, scale is not aligned. So I really think sizing has impacted Cindy's visual motor accuracy. So I go down and I'm looking at the V-scores, the numerical values, and I can see that scale is 36 and that. So she really didn't have much control of her sizing at all. The second thing that I noticed is her speed, 8 centimeters per second. Wow. That is a fast drawing speed. She really went quickly. I'm noticing the contact time is like 5 seconds. Wow. And I also noticed that 88% of her items were scored. So I'm suspecting that she was going too fast and it couldn't score some items. So this is kind of giving me an idea of what is impacting her visual motor ability and how I can help her, how I can work with Cindy. So from this data, I'm going to develop goals and I'm going to develop an intervention focus. Next slide. Okay, so from the data, I might write a goal such as this, that by September 2024, Cindy will improve her overall accuracy in forming letters from a baseline accuracy V-score of 63 to 75 as evidenced by VMP data. It's kind of an ambitious goal, but I think it's appropriately ambitious. And given the scores, my target intervention is really going to look at her sizing and helping her to slow down. So I'm focusing on her ability to control her size and slowing down to impact her accuracy. And I'm going to work with her. I'm going to work with her team. I'm going to work with her teachers. I'm going to work with her in any setting that I can to impact her. Maybe I will work with her parents and so that she can do homework at home. And then after a period of time, I would retest Cindy. Next slide. So here is Cindy's retest. And just take a moment to look at her retest. How did she perform? What is different? And were the interventions effective? So in just looking at this, first looking at the bar graph at the top, I can see that everything is way more aligned. I can see accuracy is much higher. I can see that scale is that she is really improved with her sizing control. I can also go down to the V-scores depicted numerically, and I can look at scale and say, boy, 97, that's a high score. I think that it was impactful. Also, I'm looking at her speed. She was at 8 centimeters per second, and in working with her now, she has decreased her speed to 1 centimeter per second, so much slower. She spent 17 seconds in contact time, so she's really trying hard to control and slow down, and also 100% of the items were scored. Next slide. So here, when I upload my reports to my file or present them to teams or present them to parents, I can even do a before and after. And you can see Cindy's baseline and you can see her retest scores, and right away you can see a difference between the two results. Next slide. I can also see on the progress monitoring chart, I can see her accuracy improve. So the accuracy square is pushed, and I can see her first, for her baseline to her retest, that she did very well in improving her accuracy. Next slide, thank you. And because I was targeting scale, I've pressed on scale, and I can see that, yes, I was impactful in also, this shows it this way, it shows it many different ways. I can show that her sizing control was greatly improved. Next slide. I can also show them together. So I can, here accuracy is pressed, and because I was targeting scale, they're color coded. I can see both of them that sizing really impacted her, her accuracy and her fine motor ability. Next slide. So finally, to end this section, I want to share, remember I said that there was a place where you could take notes once and just jot down anything that that you wanted to remember for later about the examinee's performance. This is where the notes appear. So here you can see, if you look at the yellow arrow at the bottom, you can see I jotted down was cooperative and attentive. Another kind of handy feature I wanted to highlight was the share results, because we're always asked, can you download the results? And so you will always, on all of our graphs, you will have the ability to download them to your file. You can cut and paste them into your reports, or for explanation to parents, insurance companies, and whatnot. Okay, next slide. Okay, so with that, in summary, we've reviewed the administration process and the multiple scoring features, and I've also provided a framework for interpretation that I hope was helpful. Now, Kimberly Coates will share a case study of how she has used Psymark tools as a school-based OT practitioner. Kim, I'll pass it to you.
Right. Hi, everyone. So just to recap, I'm a school-based occupational therapist. I've been working for about 10 years in the same school district, and I'm excited to be able to present to you guys a case study using specifically Psymark's Shapes app. So next slide. All right, so just to start off, giving you a little bit of background on the student. This student is a 7-year-old student. He is in the 2nd grade. His special education eligibility is both autism with a secondary of speech or language impairment, and he currently attends a full-day special ed class for students with moderate to severe autism. Like many of my students in that program, this student also presents with sensory processing difficulties and limited attention span, which is something that I have noticed using Psymark's apps. It is really helpful with working with the autism population. Okay, next slide. So my first attempt to assess the student's visual motor skills, I used the classic paper and pencil Beery-Butenica developmental test of visual motor integration. Many of us are familiar with this test. Immediately when I presented the booklet to the student, I could tell that he didn't want to participate. He showed poor visual attention, poor engagement. When I would prompt him to imitate one of the shapes, he would scribble instead of attempting, and he would frequently push away the booklet. After I prompted a few times, the students began to engage in some non-compliance behaviors and did attempt to elope from the area. Something to note about this student in particular is that he really dislikes using writing utensils. It's a difficult task for him. He's a 7-year-old, he's still using a fisted grasp pattern. And because of that, and because he knows he's often redirected to hold the pencil in a different way, he often resists any sort of activity where he has to grasp a writing utensil. And that is a limiting factor of the classic Beery VMI that we use, is that you have to use a writing utensil, whereas with Psymark, it is optional. So next slide. So my second attempt to assess the student's visual motor development, I used Psymark's VMP Shapes app. Immediately when I presented the iPad, students' engagement increased. I'm sure many of you guys are aware and familiar with the phenomenon of children really responding positively to screens. A lot of our students in this day and age kind of grow up on screens, and they really enjoy any sort of activity that's presented on a screen. screens are also very, there's a sensory component, there's a visual sensory component, and they tend to be very motivating in general. So the student immediately showed me a greater willingness to participate and to show a good effort. Based on knowing this student beforehand and knowing kind of a general idea of what his skills are, I could tell that he was showing a good effort and he was genuinely trying his best. He did not attempt to elope from the area. And an important factor was that he was given the option to complete the test with or without a writing utensil. And in this case, the student did opt to use his finger, which does, in a way, really help me isolate performance areas. I can isolate grasping skills from, core foundational visual motor skills. So that's a unique aspect of Psymark's apps that I've really enjoyed. Okay, next slide. All right, so the results for this student, scores indicated areas of need in scale and line precision. His contact time was also at 6 seconds, which showed that he was rushing a bit. He was going a little fast, which might have impacted his overall accuracy. So because of that, I developed goals to focus on overall sizing and writing speed. My interventions included the use of adaptive paper with visual boundaries to control for sizing, different types of pencil grips, trialing different ones to see what he responds to for his grasp patterns, and just general supported practice for handwriting activities during structured occupational therapy sessions. Next slide. Okay, so 1 year later, I did a retest to identify the student's progress. The student's IEP was due, and so I wanted to administer this prior to the IEP so that I had that good data to present. So I administered the Shapes app a second time. Results did indicate overall improvements in scale and line precision. And notably, the contact time doubled. It increased to 12 seconds, which really confirmed my suspicion that that contact time was significantly correlated to accuracy overall. And another great thing about Psymark is that I was able to include a graph in my printed report in order to share that with the rest of the IEP team members, and importantly with the parent. A lot of parents tend to get confused, or they don't necessarily fully understand what we're talking about when we just present numbers, just a general standardized score. So really being able to see that visual representation of her child's improvements over time and where her child's strengths and weaknesses are was really, really helpful during the IEP meeting. Okay, next slide. All right, so that's the end of my section. I'm really excited to continue to use Psymark's apps. I found it really helpful in my practice, and I hope you guys do too. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kim, for sharing real time what it's like in the field and with your case study. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how our apps are used. So like we mentioned, they can be used to develop IEP baselines and goals and identifying those areas of need, and then developing your goals and using them as progress monitoring. I know Kim said she gave the test after a year, but they can be used at those quarterly or trimester benchmarks, or if you're in a clinical setting, they can also be used more frequently. So the tests can be used to really target those interventions and treatment that, because you're getting objective measures in multiple areas, visual motor skills or handwriting, you can use them to identify specific areas for targeted interventions and then measure the effectiveness of those interventions on their visual motor functioning. So with this, as we mentioned, they can also be used in clinical settings to help to establish baselines and treatments. Like some of our OTs are in clinical settings and can take the test from bed to bed. If the patients are there for a few weeks, or they can use the test as frequently as needed. So working with victims of strokes or TBI, or people who have neurological conditions like Parkinson's or MS. Our tools are also currently being used in research in universities in both California and New York. And they can be used as research tools in better identification and treatment of things like learning disabilities, developmental disorders, neurological conditions, and others. They can also be used in general education settings, such as MTSS and RTI, in helping to early identify areas of need and then develop those targeted interventions and monitor the interventions for their effectiveness. So that leads us to how they can be used as a screener. So transitional kinder and kinder teachers can use our tests as screening tools, especially letter and numbers, and can help the teachers then to identify different groups, grouping their students, and then differentiating those levels of support and intervention within the classroom, the gen ed classroom setting. So if there is a district that used our tests with all transitional kindergarten students, and that is a district here in Southern California. So these were 4- and 5-year-old students, and there were 82 students who were administered letters, and 74 students were administered numbers. So we were able to establish cut scores with these numbers, and we used an analysis with the statistical package for the social studies, or SPSS, revealing results of the development of the cut scores. So these cut scores can be used as a resource to assist you in score interpretation, and then identifying students who may benefit from instructional supports and interventions. This next slide shows the results of these cut scores and how they were put into groups. So it was determined with the numbers that students who received scores of 78 and above, these 4- and 5-year-olds, were identified as proficient. The next group received scores of 67 to 77, and those were identified as emerging. The next group we put in as observation, and they received scores of 53 to 63. And then there was the intervention group who got scores of 52 and under. So those were deemed this intervention group. So with that then, the summary of our 3 visual motor progress monitoring tests. We have SHAPES, which is the progress monitoring for overall visual motor abilities. And then we have letters, and we have 16 letters in that test. And with that, the letters also help to support occupational therapists and teachers in understanding children's abilities to form letters. And numbers, there are 10 numbers, 0 through 9. And again, helping the OTs and teachers to assist students in number formation. And now we have put on this slide that hopefully you have your iPads ready and you can go ahead and install the apps. We have this QR code right on the screen that will lead you right to our apps in the Apple App Store. So you can just take a picture of it with your iPad. It will take you right to Psymark tests where you can immediately download all 3 tests on your iPad. Remember not to use a phone or your computer, but you'll need to use the iPad itself where you can access these. And because you have attended the training today, you get 90 days free, 90 days free use. There's no obligation to continue. You don't have to put in any kind of credit card or anything. You get 90 days free, and we really encourage you to do this. Start using it and give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. So here it is. Here is what the apps look like, letters, numbers, and shapes. And if you didn't get that QR code, you can just look it up on the Apple App Store. Psymark LLC will lead you to all 3. This is what it looks like on your iPad, all 3 of them. You can install the apps, and then you can register. Go ahead and register. All you need to register is to put in your email address and then put in your password, and you are ready to go. So once you register on one of the tests, you are registered on all 3. So you don't need to re-register and start over. It's all done for you. So if you start with letters, you register there, you are set to go on shapes and numbers as well. And next we have a short video to show you of what it looks like in administering the numbers test.
So are you ready? Okay. You see this number here above the line in the space? I want you to draw the same number in this space exactly how it is below the line, okay? Do your best.
So this is a 4-year-old girl that she has never had any school. She hasn't had any kind of formal training in writing. And you can go ahead and see how she approaches the test. You can also get a sense of how long it takes the test.
Okay.
And there we are at the end. So from here, we're going to go ahead and take questions. So any questions that people might have, then we'd love to take questions and answer them the best we can.
All right, we got quite a few questions coming through so far. Maybe before we start, can you just, we've had a few questions around the app, the iPad model and the rationale behind why certain iPads are used for this.
Sure, so really we are, that can be used on almost any iPad. The only iPad that it cannot be used on are the iPad minis. That the all of the others will, even if you have the professional iPad, which I do, it will adapt to that size. But the iPad mini was too small. So pretty much every other iPad is good. And we have those specifics on which iPads. They're actually on the Therapro website, and they're also on our website that will tell you exactly which iPads that can be used.
Okay, so another question coming in. Writing an IP goal with this particular tool named appears to be teaching to a test. Should you describe the performance deficit rather than test score in the goal?
Okay, great. You know what? I think I'm going to hand that over to Kim. I think she might be the best at responding to this question.
Yeah, so could you actually repeat the question one more time just so I get it clear?
Sure, it says writing an IEP goal with this particular tool name appears to be teaching to a test. Shouldn't you describe the performance deficit rather than test scores in the goal?
Yes, yeah, I agree. I think that goal that was given, that example, is just kind of maybe something that you would do more in the clinical model. But in the school setting, I would definitely write more of a functional goal. I would probably frame it around handwriting, and I believe it was a goal focusing on scale and sizing. So I'd probably frame it as functional handwriting rather than looking for a specific score. But the scores can help us in figuring out the direction that the progress is going in and figuring out where those areas of weakness are that we want to focus on in the goal.
Okay, another question coming in. How do you find an optimal speed so that student is not copying too fast and being inaccurate and copying fast enough to keep up in class?
Kim, that might be good for you to take too.
Yeah, so the speed on the scoring is really helpful. I know for me personally, I find that it's a very common phenomenon for a lot of students to rush through writing tasks, and that ultimately impacts their accuracy. So just in myself and using the app a lot, I find that that's the direction that it tends to lead me in, is that for a lot of students, they need to focus on their scale and overall contact time. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
All right, great. So there's a couple of questions coming in around why aren't all 26 letters assessed? I don't know if you can provide some info on that.
Sure. So partly because of time, the amount of time that it would take to go through each and every letter, that what we wanted to do is to get a sampling of the different types of letters that can be used. And we actually had the advice of Kim and another OT to advise us on the specifics of the letters. And so we felt like if we had a good sampling of letters, then that would give enough information and be able to give the OTs or the teachers exactly what they need to understand how the students are doing in their students' abilities to write letters.
Okay.
Dana, or is there anything else that I'm leaving out? Feel free to jump in on these questions too.
All right, the next question that's come in is, has reliability and validity testing been completed?
We have not done validity and reliability testing yet. So with that, then that is why the scores are not standardized. And what we have is we're collecting data even as we speak in working on the standardization process. But with that, then we don't, this is why it's for progress monitoring.
And I'll also add that we're in process of doing a concurrent validity study with with, I believe, the VMI, now the research that's happening now in California and in New York.
Right.
Okay, great. How much time in between would you recommend between the first administration of the test and the retest, second administration?
Right, so again, it depends on the examinee that you're working with. So if you're working in the school setting, as most of you are, what we would generally advise is to retest at those quarterly or trimester progress reports when the progress reports are due, so that you can really see how your students did. If you are in the clinical setting where you're working with patients for maybe a week or 3 weeks, then obviously you're going to give the test more frequently because you're giving that patient the intensive interventions in those specific settings.
Okay, do you always let the examinee choose between using their finger or the stylus, or can the examiner also choose for the examinee?
I mean, you can choose for the examinee. It depends on what you want to look at. So, you know, like Kim stated, one student had problems with grip. And so if you want to look to see how they would approach it, approach the test using a stylus, then that could be an option as well.
All right, are interventions done on the iPad or pencil paper?
Again, I think that's dependent on the OT. Kim, I'll let you take on that question.
Yeah, so I think they can be either or. I think evaluating simply in an iPad isn't meaning that we're limiting interventions to only an iPad. It's meant to be generalized to all visual motor skills. So like most of you, my interventions usually revolve around a combination of both iPad and actually writing by hand. So I'd recommend doing both.